Yes, why Viking helmets didn't have horns. The image of the Viking warrior, standing tall with a horned helmet on his head, is one of the most iconic representations of medieval Norse culture. Yet this image, deeply embedded in popular culture, is entirely a myth. Viking helmets did not have horns. In fact, the idea that Vikings wore horned helmets is a modern invention, one that has been perpetuated through centuries of artistic representations, theater, and eventually, film and television. To understand why Viking helmets didn't have horns, we must delve into historical evidence, archaeological findings, and the broader cultural contexts that gave rise to this enduring misconception. To begin with, let's explore what we know about Viking helmets based on archaeological evidence. The Vikings were seafaring Norse people from Scandinavia who lived between the late 8th century and the early 11th century. They were known for their raids, trading, and settlements across Europe, but also for their craftsmanship and distinctive warrior culture. Helmets, like swords and shields, were crucial elements of a Viking warrior's armor. However, helmets were not common among Viking warriors. They were expensive to produce and likely reserved for the wealthiest or most important individuals, such as chieftains or high-ranking warriors. The material evidence of Viking helmets is scarce. Only a few helmets from the Viking Age have been discovered, with the most famous being the Gjermundbu helmet, found in Norway in 1943. This helmet, dated to the 10th century, is the only complete Viking helmet ever discovered. Helmet is made of iron, featuring a rounded cap, a simple nose guard, and a band that would have provided additional protection for the face and neck. This helmet, and the few fragments of others found in Scandinavia, suggests that Viking helmets were functional, designed to provide protection in battle rather than to intimidate or display grandeur. So, where did the idea of horned Viking helmets come from, if not from historical reality? The roots of this misconception lie in the 19th century, long after the Viking Age had ended. During this period, there was a resurgence of interest in Norse mythology and Viking history, particularly in Northern Europe. This cultural revival, known as Romantic nationalism, sought to glorify the ancient past and reconnect with national origins. Artists, writers, and musicians began to draw heavily on Norse mythology and Viking themes, but often through a lens of romanticized fantasy rather than historical accuracy. One of the most significant contributors to the horned helmet myth was the German composer Richard Wagner. In his epic opera cycle, Der Ring des Nibelungen, which premiered in the 1870s, Wagner depicted characters inspired by Norse and Germanic mythology wearing horned helmets. These operas were incredibly influential in shaping the public perception of Vikings, even though they bore little resemblance to the historical reality. The visual portrayal of horned helmets in Wagner's operas was likely influenced by earlier artistic interpretations of ancient Germanic and Celtic warriors, who were sometimes depicted with horned or winged helmets. However, these representations were symbolic rather than literal, often used to convey a sense of otherworldliness or divine favor in art. Wagner's operatic characters, though fictional, became enduring icons, and the imagery of horned helmets soon spread beyond the stage. The 19th century also saw the rise of visual arts that further embedded the horned helmet myth into popular consciousness. Painters and illustrators, inspired by the Romantic movement, began to depict Vikings as fierce, barbaric warriors, often adorned with horned helmets. These images were not based on historical evidence, but rather on the imaginative interpretations of artists who sought to evoke a sense of ancient, untamed power. The myth was further popularized in the 20th century with the advent of cinema, and later television. Early Hollywood films and comic books often portrayed Vikings as brutal marauders with horned helmets, a trope that was easy to recognize and visually striking. The image became a convenient shorthand for Viking identity in popular culture, despite its inaccuracy. One notable example is the 1958 movie, The Vikings, starring Kirk Douglas and Tony Curtis. The film, though a box office success, was historically inaccurate in many respects, including its depiction of Viking helmets. The exaggerated costumes, complete with horned helmets, helped to cement the false image in the minds of audiences worldwide. Later, cartoons like Hagar the Horrible, a long-running comic strip that began in the 1970s, played with the stereotype of the horned-helmeted Viking for comedic effect. Although these portrayals were intended to entertain rather than educate, they inadvertently reinforced the misconception that Viking helmets had horns. Turning to the archaeological record, it's important to emphasize that no Viking helmet with horns has ever been found. The helmets discovered from the Viking Age are all practical in design, intended to protect the head during combat. They are typically made of iron and feature a conical shape, sometimes with additional nose and eye protection, but never with horns. The idea of adding horns to a helmet would have been impractical for several reasons. Firstly, horns would have made the helmet heavier and more cumbersome, potentially hindering the warrior's mobility in battle. Secondly, horns could have been easily grabbed by an opponent, making the wearer more vulnerable in combat. Finally, the addition of horns would have made the helmet more difficult and expensive to produce, which was not in keeping with the utilitarian nature of Viking armor. There is also no mention of horned helmets in the sagas and other historical texts that describe Viking warfare. These texts, while sometimes embellished, are valuable sources of information about the practices and beliefs of Viking societies. The fact that they do not reference horned helmets further suggests that such items did not exist in the Viking world. Understanding the practical realities of Viking helmets also requires a broader appreciation of Viking culture and society. The Vikings were not merely warriors, they were also traders, explorers, and settlers. Their society was complex, with a strong emphasis on honor, loyalty, and the pursuit of fame through heroic deeds. The helmets worn by Vikings were likely symbols of status and protection rather than instruments of intimidation. In the Viking Age, a helmet would have been a valuable and cherished possession, perhaps passed down through generations. The idea of adding decorative elements like horns, which would have no practical use, runs counter to the utilitarian ethos of Viking craftsmanship. Moreover, Viking art and iconography often featured intricate patterns, animals, and mythological scenes, but there is no evidence to suggest that horns were a common motif in their depictions of warriors. Instead, the Viking aesthetic favored symbolism that reflected the natural world, the gods, and the heroic ideals of their culture. While Viking helmets did not have horns, it is worth noting that horned helmets did exist in earlier and contemporary cultures. For example, horned helmets have been found in Bronze Age Europe, dating back to around 1500 BCE. These helmets, often discovered in Scandinavia, Britain, and the Iberian Peninsula, were likely used in ceremonial contexts rather than for combat. The horned helmets from these earlier periods were often highly decorative, made from bronze or other metals, and featured stylized animal horns or other elaborate designs. These helmets were likely worn by chieftains, priests, or other figures of authority during religious rituals or ceremonies. The horns may have been intended to symbolize a connection to the divine, or to emphasize the wearer's power and status. However, by the time of the Viking Age, such helmets had fallen out of use, replaced by more practical designs that prioritized protection in battle. The Viking helmet, as evidenced by archaeological finds, was a product of its time, a functional piece of armor designed for a warrior culture that valued effectiveness and durability over decoration. Despite the overwhelming evidence against the existence of horned Viking helmets, the myth persists. This can be attributed to the power of visual symbolism and the influence of media. The horned helmet has become a powerful icon, representing not only the Vikings but also a broader idea of untamed barbarism and martial prowess. In modern times, the image of the horned Viking helmet has been adopted by sports teams, mascots, and even certain neo-pagan groups as a symbol of strength and ferocity. The helmet's horns, though historically inaccurate, convey a sense of primal power that resonates in popular imagination. Additionally, the myth has been perpetuated by reenactments, festivals, and other cultural events that celebrate Viking heritage. Many of these events strive for historical accuracy. The horned helmet remains a popular and recognizable element of Viking imagery, often used for its dramatic visual appeal rather than its authenticity. While the horned helmet myth may seem harmless, it is important to recognize the value of historical accuracy, especially in educational contexts. Misconceptions about the past can distort our understanding of history and lead to the perpetuation of stereotypes and inaccuracies. For those interested in Viking history and culture, it is crucial to approach the subject with a critical eye, seeking out reliable sources and evidence. The true history of the Vikings is fascinating and complex, filled with achievements in exploration, trade, and culture that extend far beyond the battlefield. By dispelling myths like the horned helmet, we can gain a deeper appreciation for the realities of the Viking world and the people who lived in it. The idea that Viking helmets had horns is a modern myth, born out of 19th century romanticism and perpetuated by popular culture. Archaeological evidence, historical texts, and cultural context all point to the fact that Viking helmets were practical pieces of armor, devoid of decorative horns. While the image of the horned Viking warrior has become an enduring symbol in popular culture, it is important to separate fact from fiction. Understanding the true nature of Viking helmets allows us to appreciate the ingenuity and practicality of Viking craftsmanship, as well as the rich and complex culture from which it emerged. If you enjoyed this epic journey, please subscribe to our channel for more thrilling historical tales. Don't miss out on new videos. Hit the notification bell to stay updated.